Okay, so I just want to touch on the best practices for deploying your automations. And this is really probably the most important video in this entire course because most people deploy their scenarios incorrectly, right? They build it, they look at the logic here and they go, yep, that looks pretty good. And then they turn it on. And then they forget about it for a month because they get busy doing other things. And it's not until a month later that 100 people have gone through it and they realize that oh crap, these people all started 20 automations when they shouldn't have. All the data went into the wrong database. I've mismapped this field to that field, and a whole bunch of errors went unnoticed because you didn't correctly deploy the automation. So once you've built this automation, and ideally as you're building it, you want to be testing it. So what I normally do is I like to use a webhook trigger or a search trigger, and then I set if it's a search trigger, I set the maximum records to 1 or to 10 or something small, 5, and I just make sure that I'm returning test records in that search. For instance, here I might select the view of test, or I might have in my formula a way to filter to just the test records. If I'm using a webhook, well, I can just put my test record ID into the URL here or into the email address and just retest it that way. So the reason for that is you want to have an easy way where you don't have to resubmit a form every time that you want to test it, right? That's a very laborious way to do it. You could just submit the form once and then just re-trigger this to run based on a webhook being sent, right? That's a much easier way to do it. Or re-trigger it based on a search module. So you would normally build, say, this section here, and then you would trigger the scenario and make sure that this section here works and that everything gets mapped to the right places and the tags get added. When you test this, you might find that there's some errors happening. That would be when you add in your error handlers and things like that to resolve those issues. You would never add in, or very rarely add in, your error handlers when you're building the scenario. You'd always add them in during this testing and deployment phase, right? Because you don't want to have too many error handlers in here. 1, because it creates unnecessary work. 2, because you don't want to ignore every error, right? Quite often, something will error because it's critically broken and you need to fix it. And if you just put an ignore error on there, well, you're never going to get notified. It's just going to be forever ignored. And so if, for instance, you just had an error here and you just always ignored that error, you would miss out on all of this stuff that would happen here, and you would never know. You would never know unless you looked at the history of the scenario or you tested it, or you looked at the database and wondered why things were missing. So it could go unnoticed for 6 to 12 months, right? So when we set this up, we want to test each function in isolation. Now, if you are building a scenario that is not dependent on other, so in this case, this is dependent because we're storing the IDs and then we're referencing the IDs here. If, for instance, a leg is not dependent and you just wanted to test that one leg, you can right-click on these and then disable the routes so that you just test one route at a time. However, you can't do that in this instance because we need to set the IDs to test the other route functions as well. But sometimes you can do that to just make testing a bit less painful. So here we've run our test data, we've tested our functions, right? We've tested it. Yes, we're not getting any errors in make.com. Then we've gone to our receiving system and we've made sure that yes, these fields and these tags and these things have actually happened. If they haven't happened, then something might be happening in that we're either sending data in the wrong format to the receiving system, or the data is mapped incorrectly because we changed or deleted a field here in our form, or it didn't pass a filter, or something's happened. So that's when we dive in and we troubleshoot our scenario. Now, once you've done that and you've tested every step in this scenario, and you really do want to make sure that your test goes down each one of those routes. So you'd want to force it down these routes, test 1 where the ID is missing, test 1 where the ID is not missing, so you want to force it down each route to test it. Once you've done that, well, you're going to be 90% of the way there. The next thing is that you want to deploy the scenario. So you would turn it on. Now, when I deploy a scenario, I always set a reminder to myself. I have I create a task in my Asana or an event in my Google Calendar, and I say, follow up with this scenario, and I put the link to that scenario in the task, and I'll set it usually to be either 3 days or a week, sometimes a month, depending on how many things I think are going to go through that scenario. And I put a little follow-up task there, because you need to test it not with test data, but actually with real life data. And you want to ideally have about 10 real life datas going through your logic. And 10's usually about the right number, because that's normally enough variation to test all the different routes in most scenarios. If you've got a scenario that's got like 100 different routes for 100 different call types, well, you might need to get maybe 500 different calls coming in to test all those routes, right? But for most instances, about 10 will usually do it. So you can usually figure out, well, I'll have 10 within a day, or I'll have 10 within a month. And that's when you would schedule to review the scenario. Now, on that review of the scenario, you would look at the history log. So you go to your history in the scenario and you'd open up these in the history log. Now, importantly, you would want to open up all of these, the last 10 or so that you get listed here. You can usually see when something hasn't happened based on the operations count. So just eyeing over this, I know that when something happens, I should have normally around 24 operations. Maybe I might have a range of like 24 to 30 or 24 to 50 operations, right? Because some of them take these routes, some of them take those routes, but they all usually take this route plus then and or this route. So I would open up, say, 10 of these, or 5 of the most recent ones, whatever it is. And then I would just look at each one to see what happened. And it's really important to do this step to review the real life data, because when you're testing something, you're forcing it to work. You're putting in data usually manually in a form, and you're putting in specific data, and as the builder, you're clicking the actual things that you need to click. And you've got data in all the fields that you know that you need to have fields in, data in, and then you're testing it. When a real life user goes through the experience, if all those fields are not required, well, they may only fill out half the fields and then submit the form. And then that may break half the functions in your logic, right? Or it may alter them. So there's a test, a developer test of it, and then there's the real life use of the automation logic. And those two things are often vastly different, which is why it's really important to have 2 test phases, 2 deployment phases in every scenario. So this first one here, remember this one had 2 operations, so we know something didn't happen. So here we have our form submission, and we've got a very basic captcha in here, and this person apparently can't count because they submitted the form and they thought 5 plus 7 was 11, 5 plus 7 is 12, right? So this was actually a legitimate form submission by the looks. And this lead went unnoticed, right? So, and that's because we have this little captcha logic in here. Now, the captcha didn't error the form, but it errored the automation. And so at this point, we may need to decide, well, that's interesting, because we actually do want to still do all these steps, but we missed out on this running. Now, luckily here, this was only submitted yesterday. And so what I could do is I can edit this form entry, and then I can resend the webhook, and I could edit the form entry so that 11 changes to 12, and therefore it will pass this. And then when I resend the webhook, it's then going to carry on and do everything that it should have done here. But I would never have known about this error unless I pulled up this scenario and looked at the history. And I would never have pulled up a scenario unless it errored and it broke, or I scheduled to pull it up, right? I put in that predetermined task of 7 days out. I'm going to review everything that came in within those 7 days, right? Unless I had that task, I could have missed out on hundreds of leads over the next 12 months or even forever, because I never knew that this was a problem. right? So this is a really critical example that actually I just wasn't even planned. I just stumbled upon this, and this is an actual client account. So after this video, I'm going to send them an email. But that's a really critical thing to make sure that you're checking your automations with real data. Now, here's another one where it actually fired off correctly because they could count, and everything else works. So now we're just looking at, okay, did it go down one of these? Yes, it did. Did it do everything here? Yes, it did. What else happened? Everything looks green. There's no errors. I would also then, not all the time, but for one or two of these, usually the first one, I would check, well, did everything that I sent across actually make it to these databases? Did the tags actually get added? Did the contact fields get updated? Did the databases get updated? And then I just check them all off. And you only really need to do that for one real life example. You don't need to do it for 10 of them, but it is important to do it for one real life example. So I can see, yep, this one here, everything worked fine. Great, check that off, great. Now next one, yep, everything worked fine. And I'll just go down the list and do 10 of these or so. Now that's the initial launch, and that will get you to an automation once you've done your testing, you've checked all the things in your testing, and then you've allowed some real life tests to come in, and then you've checked those and adjusted the automation for those. That will get you to an automation that's going to be about 90-95% accurate and reliable. But we're still not done, because you really need to review your automation at regular intervals. 3 months, 6 months, at least 1 year. You don't want to just set and forget, right? Because something could happen in that time period where for some reason maybe Airtable breaks and your API breaks, and for all the Airtable modules in your scenarios, they've all got errors, error handlers of ignore on them, right? And you could go 6 months without knowing, because it's just ignoring all those errors, that the Airtable function is broken. I mean, that could be this function at the very beginning, and you could go 6 months without knowing that the rest of these functions are never being run, right? That's actually happened to me for a automation that I built for my own business, where I wasn't sending testimonial requests out for 6 months and that it was all automated, but the automation wasn't being triggered because I wasn't, or because I changed the status, the name of a status in the database, and I hadn't changed the filter in the automation, right? And it wasn't until I reviewed the automations, just on the regular 3 month cycle, that I found that problem. And this one I actually was doing on a 6 month cycle. So that, that could have gone unnoticed for 5 years. So once you've done the initial development and the launch, you want to set a regular recurring task to review all of your automations at least every 3, 6, or 12 months. Now, the frequency of reviewing them will really depend on how much data those automations have used in the last period, right? Because you need to have real life data to see if it worked or not. Now, when this comes up for accounts that I'm managing or for my own account, and for me, it's just a recurring Asana task that I have for every client that I work with, and one for myself. And I just have one task where I check all the automations at one time. That's the most efficient way to do it. What I do is I usually set that task to a couple of days, maybe a week before the renewal date of the make plan. Now, why do I do that? Well, I do that so that I can see what scenarios are running, right? So this plan renews on the 16th of March. So I would probably set it to actually run on the 10th or the 11th to review this client's account, right? Because that gives me 5 days or a week where, if I miss the task or I'm away for a weekend, I've still got time to check things before the usage gets reset. Because when the usage gets reset, all of these change to 0. And I can't just eye over which ones have been used in the past 30 days, right? I can't just go, yep, I'll check this one, this one, this one, this one, not those ones. Maybe I'll check these just a little bit, miss all those. These aren't that important. They're not being used that much. These ones, okay, I need to check those. So I can just eye over these and just pull out the really important critical ones based on the number of operations that are being used. Now, when I do this, I'm also scanning the names to see if there's anything that's an important name that maybe has stopped working completely, right? Because maybe something's broken, it's been turned off, and we've been sent an email, but for some reason I've missed the email, or the client's missed the email, or something's happened and it's just been sitting here in the error scenarios. And quite often it can sit there for 6 months without anybody noticing it. And now that thing's not happening for 6 months, right? And that's something that you don't want to find out after 6 months of the contact form not triggering something, right? So having this regular review of your automations is critical if you're going to be relying on them to run your business. It's absolutely critical. It's probably the biggest mistake that I see people making is that they build their automations, they go, yep, set and forget, and something happens, automation breaks, filters break, whatever, and the automation's not working. 6 months down the line, they've lost $20,000 in revenue because they relied on it and they added in error handlers, or it just got turned off and never turned back on, and little issues like that, where it ends up costing a lot of money in lost sales or annoyed clients because the filters were incorrect, something like that, right? So definitely set a recurring reminder to review your automations. I would suggest a 3-month reminder if you've got a lot of automations, a 6-month reminder if the automations are not that important, or if they're well aged, you built them and you've looked at them for a year. I would do a 6-month. I would be very hesitant to do a 1 year. So I'd be doing either a 3 or 6 month. And if it takes you 30 minutes or an hour once every 3 months, so be it. Those automations are probably saving you 10, 20, 30, 40 hours a month, right? Maybe even more, 100, 200 hours. So that 1 hour in the every 3 months is going to be paid off in dividends by how much time the automations are saving you for the rest of the weeks, okay? So don't look at it as an expense, look at it as an investment for maintaining your automations. It's the most important thing. Okay, so hopefully I've really stressed and brought home that that part of the development and launch deployment. It is the most important thing, but I see most people getting wrong. So I really hope that you heed this advice and you set that reminder to check your automations. If you haven't checked them in 6 months, check them right now, because I can guarantee you maybe 10% of them are probably not working how you think they're working, right? You may even have a couple that have errored that you just don't know that have errored, right? So check them, fix them, and make sure you set that regular reminder for yourself.